At 100, Dick Van Dyke is the last living symbol of Hollywood joy. But recently, his famous smile faded. He admits that the golden age he survived wasn't golden. It was a lie. The legends we worship weren't heroes. They were monsters protected by the studio system. From the predator who hunted teenagers to the patriot who preached hate, and the comedian who died in misery. Today, Dick Van Dyke finally exposes the 6 icons who ruined the dream. Errol Flynn, the devil in tights. To understand why Dick Van Dyke looks back on the golden age with such complicated feelings, you have to start with the man who invented the modern bad boy. The man who set the template for toxicity. Errol Flynn. Before Johnny Depp, before Colin Farrell, there was Flynn. On screen, he was absolute perfection. In Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood, he was dashing, athletic, and irresistibly charming. He was a man every woman wanted to be saved by, and every man wanted to be. He wore the mask of the gentleman adventurer better than anyone in history. But off-screen, Errol Flynn didn't save women. He hunted them. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn hit Hollywood like a meteor in the 1930s. The studio system, specifically Warner Brothers, realized they had a gold mine. They crafted an image of him as a refined hero, a man of honor. But Dick Van Dyke, who entered the industry when the echoes of Flynn's scandals were still loud, knows the reality was far uglier. Flynn was a man consumed by a bottomless appetite for alcohol, for drugs, and for control. He wasn't just a ladies' man or a playboy. He was a predator who refused to hear the word no. He used his fame as a weapon to disarm his victims before they even realized they were in danger. The turning point, the moment the mask slipped for the entire world to see, came in 1942. At the height of his fame, 2 teenage girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, came forward. They accused the 33-year-old superstar of serious statutory crimes. The details were sordid. They painted a picture of a man who used his power, his yacht, and his studio connections to trap young, starstruck girls who didn't know how to fight back. In any just world, his career would have ended there. He would have gone to prison. He would have been erased from the screen. But this was the golden age. And in the golden age, money outweighed morality. The trial became a circus. Warner Brothers unleashed a team of elite lawyers to destroy the character of these 2 teenage girls. They painted the victims as the villains, as gold diggers, as liars. The press, dependent on the studio for access, played along. They framed Flynn as the victim of schemers. Flynn himself treated the trial like a movie scene. He smirked. He winked at the jury. He acted the part of the lovable rogue, confident that his fame made him untouchable. And he was right. He was acquitted. The courtroom erupted in cheers. The women were humiliated, their lives ruined, and Flynn walked free to make more movies. But for observers like Dick Van Dyke, who values decency above all else, this wasn't a victory. It was the moment Hollywood lost its soul. It taught every actor in town a dangerous lesson. If you're famous enough, you can get away with anything. However, karma has a way of collecting its debts. Flynn avoided prison, but he couldn't avoid himself. In private letters discovered decades later, Flynn revealed a dark, hollow interior. He mocked the women he conquered. He bragged about his cruelty. He hated himself, but the lifestyle ate him alive. By the late 1950s, the most handsome man in the world had transformed into a bloated, red-faced stranger. Alcohol and cocaine had ravaged his organs. He looked 20 years older than he was in 1959. He collapsed in an apartment in Vancouver. He was only 50 years old. The autopsy read like a medical horror story. Heart failure, cirrhosis of the liver, stomach ulcers. His body was completely destroyed from the inside out. For Dick Van Dyke, Errol Flynn isn't a hero to be celebrated. He is a warning. He is the proof that charisma can be a mask for sociopathy. He died as he lived, taking everything, giving nothing, and leaving a trail of wreckage behind him. Kirk Douglas, the rage of Spartacus. If Errol Flynn represented the corruption of pleasure, this next man represented something equally terrifying. The corruption of power. Kirk Douglas. To the world, Kirk Douglas was Spartacus. He was a symbol of defiance, honor, and strength. He was a man who supposedly broke the Hollywood blacklist. He was a titan, but to those who worked with him, and perhaps to a gentle soul like Dick Van Dyke, who believes in kindness on set, Douglas was a man fueled by a terrifying, unquenchable rage. Born Isser Danilovich to poor Russian Jewish immigrants, Douglas clawed his way out of abject poverty. He fought for every inch of ground he gained. That fight gave him his intensity on screen, but he couldn't turn it off. On set, he was known as a tyrant. Crew members described walking on eggshells around him. He didn't just want to be the star. He wanted to be the emperor. He needed to dominate every scene, every conversation, and every person in the room. Actress Deborah Paget once famously said, "He didn't just want to win the scene. He wanted to crush you." But the darkest shadow over Kirk Douglas's legacy involves a name that still haunts Hollywood, Natalie Wood. For decades, whispers circulated in the dark corners of the industry. It was the open secret that no one dared to print. The story goes that in the 1950s, when Natalie Wood was just a teenager and Douglas was a powerful A-lister, a meeting took place in a hotel room at the Chateau Marmont. It was supposed to be an audition or a career discussion. It allegedly ended in a traumatic and violent encounter. For years, this was just a rumor, a ghost story told to warn young actresses about the dangers of powerful men. But in 2018, Natalie Wood's sister, Lana Wood, finally broke the silence in her memoir. She named Kirk Douglas as the man who assaulted her sister. She described how their mother, terrified of destroying Natalie's career by attacking a powerful studio king, told Natalie to suck it up and never speak of it again. Think about the horror of that silence. A teenage girl violated, and then told by her own family that the man who hurt her was too important to punish. This is a golden age that Dick Van Dyke looks back on with a critical eye. It was a system where the great men were protected at the expense of everyone else. The studio machine valued box office receipts over human dignity. Kirk Douglas was a beneficiary of that silence. Even without the allegations, Douglas's professional reputation was one of extreme difficulty. Director Stanley Kubrick, a genius who didn't suffer fools, worked with Douglas twice. He called him the most driven man I've ever met, but also hinted at the impossibility of controlling his ego. Douglas lived to be 103. He was celebrated as a legend. He wrote books. He gave money to charity. But for those who know the history, his legacy is complicated. He proved that you can be a great actor and a difficult human being. He proved that in Hollywood, power is the only currency that matters. Dick Van Dyke respects the work, but he mourns the collateral damage left in Douglas's wake. He knows that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up. Faye Dunaway, the Cold Queen. Evil in Hollywood doesn't always look like a violent man. Sometimes, it looks like an elegant woman with a heart of ice. Faye Dunaway. If Flynn was a predator and Douglas was a tyrant, Dunaway was a diva in its most destructive form. To a man like Dick Van Dyke, who built a career on being a team player and bringing joy to the set, she represents the dangers of an ego that has lost all connection to humanity. In the 1970s, she was untouchable. Bonnie and Clyde, Chinatown Network. She was beautiful, talented, and fiercely intelligent. But behind the scenes, she was waging a war against anyone she deemed beneath her. Stories of her cruelty are legendary. She didn't just throw tantrums. She engaged in psychological terrorism. Crew members tell stories of her stopping production for hours because the lighting wasn't flattering enough. She would make an entire set wait while she inspected her own reflection, indifferent to the fact that electricians and grips were working overtime just to please her. She reportedly slapped cameramen. She threw objects at makeup artists. She treated assistants like disposable tissues. Her co-stars described working with her as walking into a minefield. You never knew when she would explode, or worse, when she would deliver a cold, cutting remark designed to destroy your confidence. The irony, of course, is her most famous role, Mommy Dearest. In the film, she played Joan Crawford, a legendary actress known for her abuse and control. Her co-star in that film, Britannia Alda, later wrote a book about the experience. She claimed that Dunaway didn't just act a part. She became the monster. She alleged that the fear on set was real. The crew wasn't afraid of the ghost of Joan Crawford. They were afraid of Faye Dunaway. Director Frank Perry reportedly considered quitting multiple times because her behavior was so unmanageable. For Dick Van Dyke, who prides himself on creating a set where people feel safe and respected, where laughter is a currency, Dunaway's behavior is the antithesis of art. He believed that fear kills creativity. Dunaway believed fear created perfection. But karma eventually caught up with her. As her beauty faded and her box office power declined, the industry stopped tolerating the abuse. The phone stopped ringing. Directors passed on her, not because she wasn't talented, but because life is too short to work with a tyrant. In 2011, she was fired from a Broadway play, Tea at 5, for allegedly slapping a crew member. Even in her 70s, she hadn't learned. Today, her legacy is tainted. When people mention Faye Dunaway, they don't just think of Chinatown. They think of the cruelty. She ended up isolated, a queen without a court, proving that talent without empathy eventually destroys itself. John Wayne, the fraudulent patriot. Then there's the biggest giant of them all, John Wayne. For millions of Americans, the Duke is a god. He represents the frontier, the soldier, the cowboy. He is the face of American strength. But for Dick Van Dyke, and for many who look closer, the reality of John Wayne is far darker than the myth. The first crack in the legend is the hypocrisy. John Wayne built his career playing war heroes. He stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima on screen. He fought the Nazis in The Longest Day. But in real life, when World War II broke out, John Wayne did not serve. While stars like Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda put their careers on hold to enlist and fight, Wayne stayed in Hollywood to build his fame. He wore the uniform, but he didn't do the time. To some, this is a forgivable career choice. To others, it is a stolen valor that underpinned his entire persona. But the real darkness lies in his beliefs. John Wayne wasn't just a conservative. He was a man who used his platform to punch down. He was a bully. On set, he ruled through intimidation. If you disagreed with his politics, you were an enemy. If you were a young actor who didn't show enough deference, he would humiliate you in front of the crew. He believed in a hierarchy where he was at the top and everyone else was lucky to be there. And then there is the infamous 1971 Playboy interview. It is a document that, even today, reads like a manifesto of hate. In it, the American hero stated plainly that he believed in white supremacy until blacks were educated to a point of responsibility. He stated that he didn't feel wrong about taking this country from Native Americans because they were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. These weren't slip-ups. These weren't taken out of context. These were his core beliefs. For a man like Dick Van Dyke, who campaigned for civil rights, who marched with Martin Luther King Jr., John Wayne represents the dangerous power of propaganda. Wayne used cinema to sell a version of history that erased the pain of others. He played the hero, but in reality, he was often the villain of the story. On the set of The Searchers, he clashed with director John Ford. He refused to show vulnerability. He refused to show doubt. He became an ideology, not a human being. He died in 1979, hailed as a national treasure. But history has a way of correcting the record. Today, we look at John Wayne, and we see the talent, yes. But we also see the narrowness of his mind. We see a man who was terrified of a changing world, and who used his power to try and stop it. The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the pedestal he stood on. Roman Polanski, the unforgivable genius. If John Wayne represents a moral failure of the past, this next name represents the moral failure of the present, Roman Polanski. For Dick Van Dyke, the name Polanski is the ultimate test of Hollywood's conscience, and it is a test that Hollywood failed miserably. There is no denying the talent. Chinatown and The Pianist are masterpieces. Polanski is a genius filmmaker, but he is also a fugitive and a criminal. In 1977, Polanski was arrested for the abuse of 13-year-old Samantha Geimer. This wasn't a he said, she said situation. The evidence was overwhelming. He pleaded guilty to unlawful conduct with a minor. And then, before he could be sentenced, he ran. He fled the United States for France, escaping justice. He has never returned. What happened next is what truly disturbs men like Dick Van Dyke. Hollywood didn't shun him. They protected him. For decades, the elite of the film industry continued to celebrate him. They gave him awards. They petitioned for his return. They called him a victim of the justice system. They separated the art from the artist, conveniently forgetting the 13-year-old girl whose life was shattered. The lowest moment came in 2003. Polanski won the Oscar for Best Director for The Pianist. He couldn't be there to accept it, of course, because he would be arrested if he stepped on American soil. But inside the Dolby Theater, the audience stood up. The biggest stars in the world gave a standing ovation to a convicted predator. Dick Van Dyke has described moments like this as surreal. It is the ultimate proof that talent excuses everything in this town. They spoke of art. Observers reflected, while a child's innocence was stolen. Even in 2020, when Polanski won a French César Award, the industry was still divided. Protesters walked out, but many still clapped. For Van Dyke, Polanski is the embodiment of the industry's greatest sin, hypocrisy. How can you preach about justice and morality in your movies, and then applaud a predator at your award shows? It is a stain that will never wash out. Mickey Rooney, the sad clown. Finally, there is Mickey Rooney. If Polanski is the monster, Rooney is the tragedy. To Dick Van Dyke, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, the discovery of who he truly was came as a shock. Mickey Rooney was the face of joy. He was the #1 box office star in the world at 19. He was the embodiment of American energy. But behind the grin was a life of absolute chaos. Fame destroyed him early. He married 8 times. He cheated, he gambled, he burned bridges. His ex-wife Ava Gardner called him the shortest man with the biggest ego. But the real tragedy wasn't his ego. It was his emptiness. He spent his entire life trying to fill a hole with applause, women, and gambling. He made millions, but he lost millions. He treated people like props in his own movie, and eventually everyone left. And in the end, the industry that used his youth spit him out. By the time he was an old man, he was forced to keep working just to pay the bills. He was doing humiliating cameos, selling his dignity for a paycheck. But the darkest chapter came at the very end. In 2011, a frail, elderly Mickey Rooney went to Congress to testify about elder abuse. He revealed that he was being abused financially and emotionally by his own family members. The boy who owned Hollywood was now a prisoner in his own home, afraid, broke, and controlled. When he died in 2014 at age 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000. Think about that. The biggest star of the 1930s died with almost nothing. His body went unclaimed at the morgue for a time because the family was fighting over who would pay. Friends had to raise money for his funeral. It is the ultimate Hollywood horror story. The boy who gave the world so much laughter died crying. The dark truth. Dick Van Dyke looks at these legends, Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Wayne, Polanski, Rooney, and he sees the truth. The golden age was a masquerade. It was a time of great art, yes, but it was also a time of great darkness. The scariest monsters aren't in horror films, he might say. They are the ones the spotlight protects. These stories are a reminder that character matters more than talent, that how you treat people is more important than how much money you make, and that sometimes the heroes on the screen are the villains of real life. Dick Van Dyke chose a different path. He chose kindness. He chose family. He chose to be boring rather than destructive. And looking at the wreckage of these 6 lives, it is clear he made the right choice. At 100, he is still smiling. Not because he is a good actor, but because he has nothing to hide. What do you think? Which of these stories shocked you the most? Is it possible to separate the art from the artist, or should we stop celebrating these flawed legends? Let us know in the comments below. This is The Seventh Lens, revealing the truth behind the fame. Thanks for watching.